Unless you're a 16-year-old who's like a total rebel, church and weed are probably not two things that go together in your mind, which is why we were surprised to hear about a Brooklyn church that hosted a conference called the Business of Cannabis earlier this year. Our curiosity was so piqued that we had the organizers of the conference on the show to talk about why church-going communities of color need to get with the high times. So here is our conversation with Pastor Anthony Trufant of Emmanuel Baptist Church and Gia Moron, the Executive Vice President for Women Grow. I'd like to thank you both for joining us today. It's not every day that you hear about a weed conference being held at a church, so I'm curious about the inception of this. Who approached whom?
I'll let Gia.
Gia, we'll start with you.
You tell it so well. It was almost a year ago, or over a year ago now. The Reverend and I were both on an Amtrak train, and we descended both at Penn Station. We had no idea both of us were on the train. And we live in the same neighborhood and decided to share an Uber ride back to Brooklyn. And on the way back, you know, it was a casual catch-up. I'd already known the Reverend and his family for quite some time. So the natural question of, what are you up to? And I explained that. I said, oh, I'm in the cannabis industry. And it was a chance. I was a little bit nervous sharing that, just based on the overall stigma. And his response surprised me because he said, I've been reading about that. And I thought, you have? That's fantastic. So that led to a conversation, and a really interesting conversation, I'd say, that then later on led to his outreach to me saying, hey, we're doing an event at the church in June. Would you be open to bringing this information, you know, to our attendees?
And what I wanted to add this time was two issues. I wanted to add a conversation about cryptocurrency, and I wanted to add a conversation about cannabis.
This is some cutting-edge stuff for a church, I have to say.
Well, actually, not for mine. I'm able to share them all the more because I've been there almost 30 years. So there's a level of relational currency that I've put in the congregational bank over the years that allows me to draw down on these kind of experiences. Those who were opposed were just members who had memories of the 90s, having grown up during the crack epidemic, and had people who stole from them, people who did all kinds of things, and they feared that it was a gateway drug. And they thought that by doing this, you might open up the floodgates again. And with Gia's assistance, I was able to give them the facts. And once people heard the facts, it didn't necessarily change the way they felt, but it did make them tolerant.
And Gia, you're the Executive Vice President of Women Grow. Maybe you can tell me why it's important, as we're on the cusp here of legalizing marijuana in New York. It's already legal in 9 states. It's a conversation we're having nationwide. Why is it important for women and communities of color to be involved in this discussion early?
Well, for several reasons. One, right now, the industry is being led by men, and it's actually being led by white men. And what we've seen even in other industries is that it's the struggle of diversifying the industry, right? And so we have Women Grow, which is an organization that was created to connect, educate, empower, and inspire the next generation of cannabis leaders, which means is that we're not cultivating cannabis, we're actually cultivating leaders because we want to see more women and more people of color in the forefront.
And Reverend, a similar question to you. As a spiritual leader and a leader of your community, do you see this as a social justice issue? Why do you think it's important for your community to be engaged with this discussion?
I see it as a multidimensional issue. First and foremost, I see it as a matter of compassion. So for persons who don't have adequate access to medical coverage, persons who are finding themselves in an unenviable position of trying to choose between paying rent and paying for medication, cannabis is something that's far more accessible, it's affordable. The second issue is an issue of economic justice. That one, I saw an opportunity for investment, and too often is the case that people of color, and black people in particular, are left on the platform as the train of progress pulls out. And I was determined in this instance that the members of my congregation and my community were no longer going to be on the platform, but rather we were going to be on board. And the reality is, even as we're getting on board, this train has been slowly but consistently moving away from the station for some time now. Secondly, for me, it was an opportunity to look at, and Gia and her colleagues explained this to me, not only investment, but employment opportunities that are available that's associated with it. Then the last piece is the restorative justice issue. And from what I can discern from conversations that I've had with our district attorney, Eric Gonzalez, who I think is incredible, he is continuing the legacy of Ken Thompson, and he's really pushing the envelope and trying to insist that on low-level offenses, that number one, he's not going to prosecute. On number two, he's looking at the prospect of being able to expunge the records of persons who were convicted. And then thirdly, I am interested, and I haven't had this conversation with him yet, what happens if, when I should say, New York State legalizes it, what implications does that have for people who are behind bars? Will their sentences be commuted? Will they be reduced? So those are kind of my concerns, and I see this issue as multi-layered.
Gia, does your organization do any policy work, especially around this issue of restorative justice, where we know that Black and brown communities suffer disproportionately from the criminalization of marijuana? Are you working with legislators at all to try and make sure that these records can be expunged?
We are working with our local officials. We're working with, of course, advocacy groups, attending and participating in lobby days. We are speaking with and meeting with our Congress people, those on Capitol Hill or here in New York in Albany, really just to find out what can we do to help move this along. So we're doing our best not only just for the social justice piece, but also the diversity piece of it. Because if we're not stating up front that women and people of color need to be included in terms of these licenses and ancillary opportunities and loans, one of the struggles that women and people of color are having is lack of access to capital.
Reverend, I'm curious about if you delivered any sort of remarks or sermon at this conference, and about what the Bible has to say about weed. People must ask you this, right?
So, again, I have not read any passage in the Bible that talks about weed. All right, marijuana. No more than I've read any passage in the Bible that talks about the use of a smartphone or social media.
But marijuana has been around for longer than a smartphone.
Yes, but at the same time, while it's been around, more often not in communities of color, it's been around as a part of folk medicine. That I have a member of my church, I'll share this anecdote. We were sitting in staff meeting and we were talking about favorite memories that we have, and so she shared the story about having grown up in the South, and Virginia in particular, in a rural area, and she used to go out and would watch people picking a plant, and she said then they would come back and they would take the plant and roll it up and smoke it, and they used to call it life everlasting. And I said to her, that's not life everlasting, that's weed.
Potato.
So she said, well, weed's been around a long time then. I didn't know that we were exposed to weed so early in life. And so, I'm just mentioning that it's for some people, it's not as foreign a concept as you might think.
Prior to 1937, cannabis was legal, right? So without even talking about was it in the Bible or not, doctors were actually prescribing it within medicine. So we've been in this prohibition state for almost 84 years. But prior to that, doctors were prescribing it. So it's interesting to hear when people say, well, was it in the Bible? Well, actually, it was considered medicine, as it still is. If we begin to broaden the conversation to look beyond just the smoking a joint or the stigma around this, and really look at this is an actual industry that has publicly traded companies, in the Canadian stock as well as in the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. So we have to have this conversation. Otherwise, it's a huge population of people that will miss out.
It just strikes me as strange that when people start talking about marijuana use, the image that often pops up is not simply the white stoner, but the black and brown person who's on the corner selling. Well, nowadays, so somebody who was using before may have used because they discovered the medicinal qualities,
They were
wound up getting arrested and then jailed. Well, now that we have the opioid crisis, I'm watching communities where people are not being jailed, but rather they're seeing it as a health crisis.
That's right.
And they're getting into treatment programs. So why do some communities get treatment programs and it's an opioid phenomena when really all it is drug use? When people of color do it, it's drug use.
Right.
And we get jailed and criminalized. And so I find that to be very, very problematic and hypocritical. I really do think that we are going to have to start looking as a country, not about ideological bents, but about how can we find areas of commonality. How can we partner to solve some of the issues that are before us? And ultimately, the best way that I was able to do this and participate in the conversation, there is much that people can talk about with the Bible, but ultimately, Americans are not governed by the Bible. That's something that we need to remember when we start looking at this. So it's not just about what's best for the church. It's about what's best for our country. What's best for our community?
People.
What are best for our families?
Yes.
Not just what's best for the church. And our church is always invested in trying to do what's best, not just for us, but what's best for the larger community.
Reverend Trufant, Moron, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.